I'm David Bishop, author of Metagility, and this is the Agile Uprising podcast.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I am your host, Jay Hersko. Join with me once again. I have my good friend and partner in crime, Mr. Chris Merman. Chris, how are you?
Jay, you lift my soul.
Oh, well, at least I have that effect on someone. My wife just wants to stab me in the face. All right. So this week, what are we talking about? This week, we are going to talk about the book, Metagility, Managing Agile Development for Competitive Advantage. And joining us this week to talk about the book, we have the author himself, Mr. David Bishop. David, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So, David, before we go into the details of the book, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself in case they're not familiar with you?
Sure. Well, I've been in the technology industry for about 25 years. I've done just a little bit of everything, from software development to management to architecture. And I've worked primarily in telecommunications, transportation, and power utility verticals for the most part, in highly regulated industries, for example, mostly. And so about a little over 10 years ago, I was working for a company that was trying to go through an agile adoption process, and they were really struggling with it. And I thought, you know what, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so I embarked on a pretty long journey of my own to find a solution to the problem. And that resulted in the book that we're talking about tonight.
Okay. So that was going to lead to my next question is why a book? Why a book and then why now?
Right.
Well, actually, hold on. Let me interrupt David here. It's actually not now. This is, in a way, we're celebrating the book a little past its original fun launch day. David, would you like to let the listeners know what happened when you tried to originally release this book?
Well, it was released a little over a couple of years ago, and essentially it's COVID. So right as I was starting my book tour, COVID hit in March of 2020, and that slowed my roll. To make a long story short,
just a little bit of a speed bump.
If
there.
you actually got Jay, just take that in consideration, right? Not only I've written a book, I did not get a tour, I was just a schmuck helping the main schmuck writing it. So like David does is he gets an actual tour and COVID's like, nah. So anyways, I want to say that this book is a book we should have been talking about for 2 years. And, David, as soon as Jay and I started talking about it, we're like, this is there's something here, right? We need to hear more about it. We didn't get a chance to just because. So for everybody playing the home game, this is a makeup pod. We should have done this with David. We probably, if I hadn't crossed paths with David professionally, I probably wouldn't even known it existed anyway. So we're glad you're here. How did you kind of come along the starts of the book?
Let's see. You mean why did I put it in book form, or how did I come about the idea and the progression?
Whatever. You tell me.
Well, a little over 10 years ago, I was working for a company that was in the process of developing embedded systems, and they were trying to adapt Agile to their environment. They were struggling really badly, and they hired a consulting firm after firm, at least on 2 or 3 occasions, and had lots of false starts and failures. And we were in a relatively new industry called smart metering, which is at the time a relatively new industry. It's pretty mature now, but the technology was fairly new at that point. And so there was a big rush to try and grab as much market share as possible because our clients were power utilities, and these meters had like a 20-year shelf life. So once a power utility company got a contract with a provider, they were out of the market for quite some time. So the idea was to try and gobble up as many clients as possible, and Agile was perceived as a big part of being able to do that. And a lot of our clients demanded that, we were an Agile company, that we used Agile principles. But management was struggling quite a bit with trying to make that happen. And so I thought, after working with a lot of these consultants, trying to help them help us, adopt Agile, I realized that, hey, there's got to be a better way to do this. Of course, this is, 2009, 2010 timeframe. This has been quite some time ago now, but it just wasn't working. And I thought, many of these companies don't seem to really understand our business. Most of them came from the software realm, and they only worked with software. They didn't understand embedded systems. They didn't understand how to adapt Agile to hardware and firmware development. And that was a huge gap. And I thought, well, I'm going to try and fix this gap. And so one of the other problems I noticed was that there wasn't a lot of experience. Most people who were trying to coach us, didn't have any experience in that area. And they were coaching based on their experience solely. And of course, back in that time, the manifesto wasn't even a decade old. So there just wasn't a lot of research or background or knowledge out there like there is today. And so I thought, I'm going to try to solve this problem a different way. I'm going to leverage business research. So I decided to go back to school and get a PhD in business with a focus in CIS. And I actually concentrated my dissertation on solving this problem.
So that was one of the first things that jumped out at me, David, when I started reading the book is, you spoke very early on about the idea of embedded systems and the idea of hardware, software, firmware. This is a kind of unique niche, not only in software engineering and in the Agile world, but it's really, really kind of this weird sort of corner that doesn't really get a lot of sunlight. You know what I mean? Like when I started reading through your book, I'm like, oh, this is different because everybody talks about Agile. And you have Joe Justice talking about Agile Tesla, and everybody talks about Agile and hardware and building cars and whatnot. But there is a complexity that comes with the software, firmware, hardware triumvirate that you actually kind of put together rather interestingly. And that leads me to how you actually wrote the book, right? Because this isn't a book where, most books fall into two categories. It's a narrative, right? It's the L.E. Goldenrat theory of constraints. You're telling a story, or it's framework, pattern, framework.
Step one, step two.
Right. Very, very prescriptive. Whereas yours was very much here's our ideas, here's where we're coming from, here's actual feedback from people we're working with. So there was a lot of almost quasi case study conversation embedded in the content of the book to show that, hey, this is where we're coming from and this is why we came that way. How did you end up that way? Because it is a very novel approach. And honestly, that's one of the things that kept me reading, because I never read a book structured like that.
Well, it's based on this idea of grounded theory research, which is a form of qualitative research. And it's actually pretty innovative. Grounded theory is this idea of taking these case studies and analyzing the data in such a way as to find out what the central phenomenon is and break it down into its components, if that makes sense. But it's essentially, I think what makes the book so interesting, what you're seeing there is this grounded theory research approach, which makes it pretty different. And
Jay, I just figured out what we're going to spend the second half of this podcast talking about. So I want to find out more about this book, and then we're going to find, because like this grounded theory, I have not utilized it. So I would be curious more to the nuts and bolts. Cause think about it. David, how's the amount of time that you spend getting data and then you look at it and they're like, oh, it's quantitative. It's there's actual hard numbers and stuff. And then you look and there's numbers, but they feel really soft. They're not grounded to a lot of, hard coded facts. It's a lot of feelings put along with numbers. And then, so, you're really no more different than, analyzing the number of times that someone says DevOps in a retro with machine learning than you would look at that kind of fuzzy data. So really, David, we're presented with this vast amount of a trove of awesomeness, but it's all qualitative. And yet we're still feeling around in the dark on how to understand it, right?
Yeah. I think
so. How did you? When did what is it about? What is it about your algorithm or your sorting stack or whatever that kind of got you to click some light bulbs on and go, oh, that now I'm seeing qualitative in a new way, almost seeing it more from a quantitative perspective?
Yeah, I think that I spent some time researching how to do the research. what my methodology was going to be. And I've
Gotta love engineers. They need to explain. They need to explain how they're going to explain something. Like, God bless you. God bless you, David.
Right. Yeah. So I realized that, I found that qualitative methodologies are probably the best way to research IT projects. There's actually papers out there that talk about that, because IT is highly contextual. And that's what qualitative research focuses on is the context. And, we're talking about a context right now, the context of embedded systems and how Agile applies to that. As opposed to a quantitative approach, which is more statistical, more numbers related, but you don't really get the story. You don't really get the context. You don't really get the find out what that central phenomenon is. That's the mystery behind the madness, so to speak, if that makes sense. So it's not only is it more interesting, but it's more applicable to our industry.
Well, and executives of all shapes and sizes understand that language much better than they can. Hey, here's a slide with a bunch of numbers on it,
Right.
Yeah, that was one of the things that jumped out at me is you took a qualitative approach to end up with quantitative numbers, which is it's a yeoman's amount of work, right? There's a lot there's a lot of work that actually went into that. So speaking of the grounded systems theory, David, I would like to ask you about your, and with an engineering background, this does kind of make sense, the use of fluid dynamics, right? As a metaphor, right? Like, Merman will tell you, I read everything, right? I read everything. I actually had this book on the pile until Merman said, hey, did you ever get through that? Because I work with David. I'm like, oh shit. Well, it's now at the top of the pile. But I've never seen that choice of metaphor before. And when you start, and we're going to go into next, we'll go into the idea of the metagility and the whirlpool and whatnot, the viscosity and vorticity. The more I read, the more it made sense. How did you land on that as a metaphor?
Well, thought experiments have always been a really good way of explaining complex topics, like Einstein's elevator, for example. He used that to explain relativity, right? And so a lot of researchers use these thought experiments to illustrate, whatever theory they're trying to expound upon. And so I was trying to find the same thing, because Agile vorticity, as you'll find, is pretty complex when we get into it. So I needed some kind of illustration to make it more easy to understand and explain. And the idea of flow is a common term. It's commonly associated with agility, and it's also commonly associated with innovation. There's a guy named Everett Rogers who wrote a book called The Fusion of Innovations, and he talks about how innovation is like a flow, right? And how my theory connects to that is that inside this flow of innovation, you have these little whirlpools that sometimes occur depending on different market conditions. And so those whirlpools explain Agile in a specific context, like embedded systems, for example, and why you may have these rapid this rapid change in a specific industry or for a specific type of product.
Can I tag in real quick on that, David? Like this idea of we keep coming on, like embedded systems is kind of was your entry point into seeing kind of a layer on top of, maybe not a layer on top of agility, but like this, the title says it all itself, right? There's this layer kind of floating around, above, below, whatever you want to call it, agility, right? And that does say, hey, so what if all right, so I'm reading the manifesto, I'm reading all the principles, I'm reading all these books about mindset and everything. Why did we miss something? Like a lot of times people talk about what Agile misses out on this, Agile misses out on this, this is missing from the coaching stands, this is missing from the manifesto, this is missing from this framework, nobody even cares about this piece, and this is all over here, kind of a thing, right? So like there's been a lot of Agile for this, Agile for that, and I don't, when you and I first talked one-on-one about this, you gave me this sense of, I'm not trying to recreate something, right? I'm trying to, like, I forget the exact phrase, like you'd like to bolt on, you'd like to add to, customize, whatever, but you felt like there was something missing. Why do you think that that's something that Was that a fruitful effort for you, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it? Like, forget the fact that you wrote a book and book tour and we're getting to talk about it now. Like, I get talking to me is super cool, but it's not that cool, right? So this notion of why did you feel like you needed to keep going down this path of there's something plus, something and something more? Like, why did that do why did that start?
I think it's because of what we see in the industry today. I mean, it's not about software anymore. It's about devices. And all the innovation happening today is really around devices, smart cars, IoT, smart thermostats, smart everything. And 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. It was all about websites and software, right? And so I think as the industry started to develop more of these smart devices, this idea of embedded systems and making them more agile became more and more important. And I think that's why it was missing originally, because 20 years ago, it wasn't really a thing. And then in the past decade, it certainly has. It's been where all the innovation is happening.
It'd be great if we could secure these devices too for
that's security. Who needs security? Right.
Sure.
I've seen the movie Runaway. Tom Selleck
not a part of the cloud.
Tom Selleck will defend us.
Security is absolutely not part of the cloud.
When Chris was asking that question, David, I think I came with an answer in my head. So after reading the book, I'm going to try and answer that, and you tell me if I got the book right.
I'm
so
just going to ask Jay the questions from now on, just for the rest of the podcast.
This is like David's the teacher. He's giving me the exam here. Yeah. If I answer wrong, he knows that I definitely read the Cliffs Notes, not the real book. So you asked, what is this adding on to the thought of agility, right? And the thought of the manifesto. What was missing? Well, when I look at the picture in the book of the whirlpool, right? In the middle of that whirlpool is market pressure, right? And then around that market pressure is pulling it. That's what amounts to market agility. It's pulling product in. It's pulling that product genesis. And that product genesis is pulling along the software agility. So I would dare say, David, keep me honest here. I would dare say that the book calls out the explicit driver that's pulling, for lack of a better term, the agile forward. It's the market and the product demands that are actually pulling forward. So I guess we kind of answer our own question, Merman, on did I get the A, Professor Bishop? Did I get the A?
Yeah, I think that's a great depiction of it.
Such a kiss ass.
Well, but here's the thing, Merman, right? How many times have we worked on transformations where we're changing how we do the thing without realizing why we're doing the thing? And explicitly why we're doing the thing is the market is pulling the business in a direction that it behooves them to do this.
Sure. I mean, like, think about, it's not like you can draw a straight line from the base, from Kent's book, his first book, all the way to Metagility, right? I know there's been many translations, been many interpretations, many this and that, and actually this from a technical capacity. No, it's this. No, it's whatever, right? Like, no, we build everything as code. No, it's about touch free and democratized and all these words that we use, right? But there is something to be said for, we've always attacked agility from a process side first, and we ignore the technical pieces that really make this stuff better. And David just pressed on that nerve until he found something with a pulse and said, there's nothing here, right? I love that we're selling David's book for him. And David, I apologize. Jay and I talk way too much on these podcasts, so you're just gonna have to be a good teeny and step in here. Like, where do you think we stand from a technical excellence standpoint today versus 10 years ago?
Well, I think we're certainly better. We're certainly, I think we have a higher degree of technical excellence today than we did a decade ago. And I think Agile has been a big part of that. I think we've seen, more larger, more complex organizations with more complex products adopting Agile, albeit I think in a more of a hybrid way, which is what the book talks about, is that, hybrid agility was often looked upon originally as sort of a problem, or this is a failed Agile adaptation if you have a hybrid approach, right? But that's actually part of what made this organization more technically excellent, is their hybrid Agile adaptation actually helped them become number one in their market in a couple of my case studies here. And we found that especially with embedded systems, that's been a key to helping them achieve market dominance.
So before we go down, I wanna pull on that hybrid string. But before we go there, David, I'd like to ask you if you could, because I think this word actually comes into play here. Can you define for our listeners that term vorticity and how that relates to what we're saying here? Because again, I think I could get the A on the test and explain it, but I'd rather have you do it.
Sure. All right. Well, here it goes. That's a little bit long, but we're going to dive into this river of vorticity here. So, we characterize innovation as a flow, right? Like a flow of water in a river, for example. And the water that's closer to the bank is actually slowed by friction. So the water that's in the middle is running faster than the water that is closer to the bank. And so if you have like a vorticity meter, which is like it's like a little floater with a flag on it, you stick it in the water, it's going to spin because there's a great difference between the two flows of water. One's moving much faster than the other. And the faster that meter spins, the higher your vorticity. If the flow of water is moving at the same pace, you're going to have zero vorticity and it's not going to move at all. So if you go back to the illustration you mentioned earlier, the whirlpool, where you have the market pressure in the middle, you have your product genesis outside of that, right? And it's pulling the organization, the development organization is trying to match that speed. So the vorticity meter is going to be stuck right there between product genesis and the organization. And it's going to measure how fast the different flows of water are moving. And if the inner flows of water, the market pressure and product genesis is moving really fast and the organization is moving really slow and they can't keep up, you're going to have very high vorticity. If the organization is able to keep up, they're able to match the product genesis. They're able to get that product out the door as fast as the client's demanding it. Then you're going to have zero vorticity because they're all moving at the same speed. And that is your measure of agility. And that's been the big nut that the industry's been trying to crack for a long time, is how do we measure agility? And that's what this research does, is it solves that
Can
problem.
you keep up with what's being asked of you by, not by bosses, not by people whose paychecks depend on, right, getting more features out, depending on like getting more decks ready, whatever meta work, right? Let's pull meta into everything, right? Like getting, instead of like meta value, like actual value, like the value is needing you to go faster. And we have, I mean, you said, I asked you if we're technically better than we were 10 years ago. Well, we have to, just because of the number of, like, it's like Agile, we're getting better with every legacy system we sunset, right?
with every failed transformation, it's one step closer.
No, with every time we sunset a legacy application that's more than 30 years old, like the more, the less we need COBOL, right? Like, or whatever,
It's never going away. Don't kid yourself. It's never going away.
That's fine. I picked a random language, but what David's really calling out is we have to make our systems able to keep up with the markets demanding it. And we put a lot of band-aids on things. Like, David, tell me about the band-aids you've seen on all these systems over the last 10 years, just say, right? Like, we used to joke, the very first app that I was a QA lead for, we used to say it was held together with baling wire and duct tape. If you breathe on it wrong, it'd break in production or whatever, right?
Right.
And it was a charging and billing app. I mean, it was nobody's lives were making any better, although it kept making the company money. But that idea of we're just going to duct tape and band-aid our way to another year. Let's get 2 more quarters out of this. Let's get 4 more quarters out of this. I've heard that so many times. Let's just get 3 more quarters out of this system and then we can sunset it, right? Like, which means I'll come up with another excuse to not sunset it in a year, right? Like, you've seen this a lot. Like, why do we have a problem saying goodbye to like old crappy systems?
Yeah, I think it's there's probably a lot of good answers for that. I think a lot of it's just resistance to change. Change is painful for some, and changing an old legacy system requires a lot of times it requires not just a transformation of a process, but transformation of the business, really, because you have to rethink your business in many cases, and business transformation is hard. It has a high failure rate, just like Agile transformation does, really. And so I think a lot of kind of like, just as we as individuals, if we try to transform ourselves, we try to lose 100 pounds, right? Or we try to build a bunch of muscle, at 40 plus years of age. It's very hard to do without a coach. And I think a lot of
HGH, cocaine, yeah, those kind of things. You really, you
Jay's diet plan is to
you need
shave
Barry
his beard.
Bonds as trainer is what you need. You need Barry Bonds as trainer. Yeah.
Jay shaves his beard and goes, I lost 5 pounds, honey.
So yeah, I think that I think organizations have the same problem. They can't do it without a coach, and a lot of times that's what it takes to do these kinds of agile transformation, business transformation, digital transformation, which often goes hand in hand with getting rid of these legacy systems, right?
It's funny you speak about business transformation being so hard. Like I started on the business side of things and moved and got more technical as it went. You probably, your arcs, maybe not exactly the opposite, but you probably came at from another angle. But all we're doing is really highlighting like whatever we thought we came in knowing. And that was the thing. Like, if you just do this, you'll be agile. If you just do this, at least you'll be agile enough or whatever, right? Like, as if that's like David said, hybrid used to be a bad word. Like agile, and like we've on this podcast made jokes about, oh, that's agile enough, as if like that's a derision, right? Like, what if that's enough?
It has to be. There has to be some sort of middle ground.
Yeah. Like, but so anyways, but what Dave is talking about, something completely different. Like, this isn't an option. Like, the vortex means the market's going to dictate you go, or you're going to get swallowed up, right? Someone's going to miss an opportunity. There's growth loss. There's jobs lost. There's, market share loss. There's any number of things, right? Or it could just be slowly dwindling away of you being cool. Like Microsoft market share has not necessarily gone down, but in the last decade, nobody is like showing up to work going, can I please have a Windows machine? Everybody's like, no, give me that sweet silver chrome on my work machine, dude. Right. I'm just saying, like, there's something that can be lost, right? Regardless of whatever it is.
Yeah. I'm not asking for a MacBook. Moving along. But to your point though, right? So we have this whirlpool, and you have the market is pulling at a certain speed, which is pulling the business along at a certain speed. So where we kind of struggle with transformations is where that business agility meets that software technical delivery agility, right? That's our first point of Vorticity. But David, when you went into the weeds with the back to embedded systems, when you went into that piece and talked about how if you look at software, firmware, and hardware as 3 different cycles inside that whirlpool, and where it doesn't make sense, not only can you really feasibly not physically build hardware at the same speed at which you can design and deploy software, it makes sense to have a little bit of a slower pace, not necessarily a warp speed vorticity between the two, but it does make sense to slow them down enough to account for just the way you deliver work and the way you deliver value. And that tied back to the hybrid agile thing, where we walk in and we swing the safe banner and we say, no, 2-week sprints, 5 in a row is a PI. 5 PIs a year, go forth and conquer. Where if you're in this type of environment that has, and I know we have some listeners that do some embedded stuff, right? Some IoT stuff. If you're dealing with hardware, software, and firmware simultaneously, you need to be, I hate to use this word, but you need to be a little pragmatic, right? In how you sequence that stuff so everybody is keeping pace, so it flow, the magic F word.
Telecommunications is built on embedded systems, and they're getting, and as they get more intelligent, right, as edge networks like Verizon's putting out, like they're only going to get some. It's not like in 5 years we're going to go, well, we've built all the smart devices we need,
Right.
Sorry, David, you were saying.
I was going to say that in the research I found that software, firmware, and hardware adopted Agile differently, but they did it in such a way as to obviously it helped develop the product the quickest, because each one of those domains was developing their own product. They had a hardware product, they had a firmware product, they had a software product, but it all had to be tested and released as one cohesive product together as well. And so, for example, the software domain, they would have 2-week sprints, right? They would have a full agile adoption as you would expect it to be. And the organization also often used software as sort of like a sort of a way to solve solve really bad problems. Like, for example, if you think about um, well, the Boeing 747s, right? When they had their problem, it was really they solved that problem through software. It was actually caused by bad software, and they fixed it with software. But with an embedded system, it's easier to fix problems with a software solution because it's quick, it's easy, and the software teams typically move faster. As opposed to like a firmware or a hardware solutions. They try to
Right.
find software solutions to fix these really critical defects. And then your firmware teams, they're going to have longer sprints, typically like a 30-day sprint, because they don't have to move as fast. And their development is often tied to the hardware teams. And the hardware teams, they typically have more of a waterfall mode of operating, but they also have something called like low budget projects, or what we called in the research C-level projects, where it's almost like a rapid prototyping, where if the software or the firmware team needs some sort of a test harness to be able to develop against, they would develop this rapid prototype to give them something to work on, so they wouldn't have to wait on them. And so it was interesting to see and document this interplay between all three of those domains and how they work together in the most efficient way to get the product out the door.
So onto that note about software helping with hardware challenges, I found a value stream once with a client years ago that the hardware was right smack dab in the middle of the value stream. So you had all this software, people, processes, and software that drove the first half of the value stream. Then it got handed off to a hardware system, like something being, so like people and planning and all that kind of stuff on the front end. Then equipment gets installed, right? So value stream up until that point in time, hardware, and then once it works and then is provisioned, or once it's online and capable and networked and everything, then there's all the software that happens on the back end, provisioning. You can tell I'm going into telecommunications, like those of you that have played the home game, right? So like, how do you? It's interesting. I found that value stream the hardest, just because like you always want to kind of build a buffer around hardware, like you said. So like when it's smack dab in the middle of the value stream, I mean, it almost feels like you're doing like a reverse waterfall sandwich where you've got agile around either side of it, and you've got to give that buffer of, hey, something may go wrong, the lab may not be right, the hardware. Does that make sense what I'm saying, David?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about the interplay between those three domains and how they self-organize and work together. One of the things I did in the research is, well, when you talk about agility, you often hear about interactions, right? That's one of the tenets: people and interactions over processes and tools. Right. But what are the interactions? What are they? How do they work? No one's really documented that, and that's one of the things I gleaned out of the research. Is I categorized these different kinds of interactions into 6 different categories, and figured out, well, what is the interplay between these 3 domains? What kind of interactions do they have, and how do they manage that? And that's what's a big part of what's in the book.
Yeah, and that I really enjoyed, because Discipline Agile talked about being enterprise aware. And there is the concept of, starting agile in the middle and the waterfall pieces on the outside where need be, and then just slowly shrink them away. And especially when it comes to embedded systems, I think you're never going to be able to shrink those things fully away because of, like you said, the pace at which that work is done. So, there really is no right or wrong agile. There's either successful agile or not. And I think when you make a point in the book where you said, hybrid agile is the only working solution. And I read that and I went, yeah, he's right. And I actually would argue that the larger the organization, the more hybrid of an approach you need, because of the complexity, because of the friction against the various rings around the whirlpool.
Well, it's actually a function of, there's a guy named Barlow, which I cite in the book, where he talks about how, it's a function of how large the teams are and how complex the product is, essentially. Absolutely.
See, now, Jay, you just pissed me off, because now I have to think, like, now I'm thinking about all of those times. Think about the number of conference presentations, white papers, blog posts, videos, whatever, talk about the pureness of whatever it is we're doing. Like, this notion of you can't, like, if you're not doing it this way, you're not doing whatever. Pick the thing, pick the framework, pick the methodology. Oh, that's not Kanban. This is Kanban, right? Or whatever.
But David kind of proved us wrong. He kind of proved us wrong, right? I mean,
well,
hey, listen,
so
earlier,
here's
sacred
the thing.
Merman, sacred cows make the best hamburgers. But keep going, keep going.
I love it. They're delicious. I can't wait to eat more sacred cows. And I apologize if anybody does not like beef. It's a metaphor. It's really, I don't really.
Shibboleth. We're challenging shibboleths here. I'll choose a different metaphor. Keep going. Keep going.
I just think that like it's like I feel my blood boiling over the shame that either I've tried to give someone else or I've listened to someone give someone else, because like, man, your stand-up was 22 minutes long, bro. Like, are you sure you're agile? You sure?
Yeah. There was definitely
15. And I picked the most basic thing, right? Like most basic thing. Most pragmatic people say there's no difference between a 15 and a 20-minute stand-up. But it's just this notion of like the same, everything you're saying, David, it resonates with me because I've had a lot of UX conversations at my company lately. I've met with some of the creative folks out of the house trying to make sure that they're part of this agile party that I'm throwing. And so I've heard a lot about their things, and it feels the exact same way that we're talking about embedded systems, that we're talking about any sort of hardware of sorts. Like there is this kind of bubble of, hey, I may not get something done in 2 weeks. You may not get a user story smaller than a sprint with designers. You may not. I don't know. A lot of people every designer's weird. You put the best agile coaches in front of UX strategists and pixel pushers and information architects. Like you give them data and you say analyze, and they're like, all right, I'll get back to you. When? I don't know. I'll get back. Like sometimes this stuff just takes time. So like, why are we? I don't know.
You're gonna go off and do some soul searching, but to your point though, right? And to what David brought up, when you have, even if you're listening to this episode and you don't do anything in firmware or even anything in hardware, think about those 3 rings as, say, for example, you're doing software, which is built upon Oracle financials, right? Your GL system, which is built upon an Oracle backend, right? Like there is some vorticity there as well, getting the database changes at the right time, because you're now hitting what amounts to a black box system in Oracle GL, which you're then putting software on top of. So this conceptually is useful for all of us, right? Because there is that, or even like, I mean, let's go down the safe rabbit hole, right? Your platform teams or your system teams, right? There's some vorticity there as well, where that friction comes into play. And just being aware of that, I think puts us in a better place. And I will, we're coming up on time here, but one of the other things you talked about, David, was you went through some of the different approaches that have been tried in the past, what works, what doesn't. And you made a very interesting call out, like crapping on agile methodologies is basically a cottage industry these days, right? Like all you need to do is go on LinkedIn, grab some founder, talk a little snark, and then you'll get, all these cavalcades. But
I'll tell you who to follow on LinkedIn if you want to follow all those trolls. I got to DM me. I got a whole list of those people I block.
You made a really good point where I actually wrote this down verbatim. I forgot the page number, but you said, when you're talking about the idea of agile at scale, and especially when it comes to scaling frameworks, you said most frameworks and methodologies focus on the project management side of agile, meaning we look at velocity, we look at things like release frequency, or we look like percentage of sprint complete, but we don't give ourselves the time to allow for evaluation of the adoption of the principles, right? Which is where your grounded theory comes in, where you're not just looking at the PM piece, but also trying to pull that out of someone's soul to see if they've really got it.
Right. Yeah, you really have to, it goes back to a little bit back to business transformation. You really have to rethink your business. You have to change from the iron triangle to the agile triangle, like Jim Highsmith talked about, where you're focusing on constraints, value, and quality, right? As opposed to that old iron triangle of scope and budget and time. And that requires you to basically rethink everything if you put that agile triangle in place. And that's probably the most important thing, not just the rituals, the process.
Vorticity applies to learning this stuff as well, right? Like, I mean, if you think about a whirlpool, when you're on the furthest outside, right, you're barely even feeling anything. It barely even feels like water's moving. It's just kind of but it's only when you're really in the vortex and you reach a certain ring does the pace picks up. And so like this applies to this. If I need to explain why Agile, like why transformation takes so long, why whatever framework, whatever technology you want to adopt, like getting Kubernetes tuned the right way, it doesn't matter, right? Like there is, like when you're on the way furthest outside, the water's fine, right? Like you can look, you can peer in, you can go to a meetup every now and then all of a sudden you get a cert, you get a couple of certs, you join, you're a presenter at conferences, you're running your own teams, and now all of a sudden you're in charge of training. Like, I mean, the last 5 years for me, I mean, the pace just keeps picking up of my learning of stuff that I'm having to do. Same thing with the cycles and vorticity of our product, right? Like, hey, someone kind of mentioned it once. One customer mentioned on a call once. Okay, not a big deal. Hey, we got 5 calls this week on this. And as the you get further down, this is becoming more of a problem. We're receiving monitoring's getting even more messages, more error codes, more of this and that, it just speeds up the more it is. And if your system can't handle it, if your people can't keep up with people griping, right? I mean, social media teams are just keep tracking of the number of people that gripe about us on Twitter, right? Like if your system can't keep up with it, you're going to get smoked. Yeah. And people are going to get fired. And it's because you didn't choose to measure how fast that part of that circle was going. So like, if anything, David, like starting with understanding all the vorticity of your org in the various stages of the funnel or the whirlpool and measuring that, you're lost, right?
Absolutely. And it's all about keeping an eye out for the next whirlpool too, because, in some of our case studies, we found that, okay, at some point the market gets saturated and now you have to develop a new product line. So in some of our case studies, they became number one in their market with this one whirlpool of, like, for example, smart metering, but they didn't advance into the analytics, the data analytics part of it fast enough. And so they didn't jump in that new whirlpool fast enough and they lost their market share. So that's just one example of, hey, you've got to focus on your current whirlpool, but look out for new ones too and be ready to jump in.
It's just really novel to say, we need to see how fast we can respond at the different levels that we're at. Identifying, getting, this is a really complex problem to get people to grok and identify. And so please, everybody, go read Metagility if you want to read more about it. Hand it to your executive, hand it to your CIO, CTO, if they're trying to understand, hey, have we measured our vorticity yet of all our different rings inside, this vortex, right? If we're not doing that, and how do we even know that our systems, like, how are we supposed to learn that? If you just ask those questions, that's the start of real transformation, right? So,
yeah. Don't let the fluid dynamics metaphor overwhelm you. I mean, I got my cover right here on page 79, figure 4.4. David, I have a separate Slack group I'm part of, which is just Agile Nerds. And I was reading the book outside and I took a picture of your image of the whirlpool and all that. And I texted it to the group, no context. And I said, I think this guy gets it. And to watch the responses, we're like, what is this? This is wait a minute. Because one of the guys in the group does embedded system development. And he's going, and then I get, oh shit. And then there's 10 minutes later, I see, oh shit. Then at 15 minutes later I get a private DM where he goes, yo, what book is this? I need to get a copy of this. So, like,
wait, there's a Slack that you're a member of that I'm not on too.
Yeah, I try to mix my Agile nerd populations. It's like the end of Southland Tales. You'll shake hands. And
what am I to you?
It's gonna get crazy. But the point is, even if this sounds a little bit daunting to our listeners, check out the book, pick that up. If you can't pick that up and look and grok it, it's not overwhelming. And David, I mean, in the hour we've been talking, we really haven't done a service to. There's a whole lot more in the book. You talk about, document just enough, not just
read
because.
the cliff notes of the cliff notes.
I mean, you talk about dealing with government regulation. You talk about requirements. You talk about all releases, right? It's how to schedule releases. All these things where when you the pessimists that are listening to this, or the pessimists who are reading the transcript, is going to say, oh, well, what about this? What about that? I guarantee you that 99.9% of the things you're going to complain about, David has already talked about in the book. And it's not that he's talked about it in a theory, navel-gazing sort of way. You've actually done questionnaires where you've gotten feedback from people who have done this to say, yes, we encountered that, and this is how we solve for it.
Yep.
Right. Absolutely.
Let's land this sucker, Jay.
We're getting on. So David, if people want more information, right? If they want to get a copy of the book, they want to reach out to you. Maybe they want to pick your brain. Where do they go? Where do they find you?
Well, they can find me on LinkedIn. They can also find me on Twitter at David Anth Bishop. And also you can find the book wherever books are sold, on Amazon and pretty much everywhere, I think.
Awesome. Yep. Awesome. So on behalf of Chris and myself, David, we want to thank you for coming on and taking the time with us.
Yes.
Even though we kind of did turn your book into a book report, but everybody should check it out anyway.
Everybody read it.
On behalf of David, Chris, and myself, I want to thank all of you for tuning in and listening again. If you like what you heard, please give us a review, a rating, some feedback on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, PodHub, your podcast listening platform of choice. If you want to talk more about the book itself, we have a very vibrant Discord server. Please hop on in. We want to thank the artist Krebs from Machine Man Records for giving our outro music royalty-free. Maybe someday we'll monetize YouTube. And last but not least, we are committed to always being a free show. However, we do have a Patreon, and we now have a $15 a month Patreon where you get surprises in the mail. What are you going to get? Who knows? Maybe it'll be stickers. Maybe it'll be magnets. Maybe it'll be a copy of socks.
I would have seen what's coming. It's pretty nuts.
Yeah, we're going to send everybody a copy of my SPC manual. So once again, thanks everybody for tuning in. And until next time, this is the Agile Uprising podcast signing out.